Hi, Lisa. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure.
I have to say, I've got two firsts going on today. The first is this is the first time we are in our eighth season of the Beginner's Garden podcast that we've ever talked only about flowers. And this is the first book. I'm holding it up for those on YouTube can see it. This is the first time I've ever read a flower only book. And we can get to why in just a minute. We really focus on vegetables, but is it just me? Because I'm really interested in it. But are you seeing a resurgence in people interested in flowers right
Oh
now?
my goodness. It started probably about 10 years ago, but it really got ramped up during the pandemic as gardening did in general. And yes, it is amazing how many people are recognizing the significance. Flowers are beautiful and they make us all feel good, but they do a whole lot more than that, bringing the good guys to your garden. And so, yes, flowers, thank goodness, are finally getting their day again.
Well, I have to be honest. I grew up, my mother grew more flowers than vegetables, and that was her thing. And I don't know if it's just a natural thing where the daughter kind of, decides to do her own thing, but I find myself coming back a little bit, and she's been gone for 8 years. So it's kind of sad in a way, but I'm like, maybe she's up there going, "What are you doing growing all those flowers, girl?" Because I never was interested in it. Because when I first started gardening about 10, 11 years ago, my whole thought was, why grow flowers if you can't eat them? Which I know some you can't eat. But the point is,
Right.
I wanted a vegetable garden because I wanted to be able to grow our own food for my family. That's my story. But I've been hearing from a lot of my audience who also, food production is an important part of their lives too, but they are telling me they want to start incorporating flowers in their vegetable gardens to beautify the space that they already have. So you're a cut flower grower. That's your primary thing, and we're going to talk about that because I think it's important to learn from experts who are really good at what they do to help us in our home gardens. But what is the difference between incorporating flowers into the vegetable gardens we already have and growing cut flowers? It's like, is there a difference between the two if someone's not growing flowers to sell them or take them to market?
Sure. So I actually wrote a book called Vegetables Love Flowers also. And that book really introduces this concept that vegetables really benefit from the presence of flowers in the garden, not only for the gardener to enjoy beautification, cut some, take them in the house, but it is the foundation of our organic growing garden. That's what, in fact, is home base to all the beneficial creatures and birds and pollinators. And there's no better way to provide that constant presence of flowers than with a cutting garden because you cut it, it's constantly regrowing. The same concept that your vegetable garden is regrowing from. And so it does a couple of things. It beautifies, it provides for pollinators, and it really invites beneficial creatures in that benefit your vegetable garden also. So it's kind of the same flowers, different varieties occasionally of that flower, but it just really fits a need. Because I'll tell you what I find people will say, "Oh, well, I put flowers in my vegetable garden once and I didn't see any difference." Then you say, "Well, what did you do?" And they said, "Oh, well, I put an 8-inch pot over in the corner and it bloomed for like 4 weeks and then it was done and I never saw flowers again." Well, that's not what we're talking about, friends, right? We're talking about a constant supply, and a cutting garden is the perfect solution.
So, for those who are new to the flower concept, is there a difference between a cutting garden and, say, like, I'm planting nasturtiums all around my vegetables? And I don't think that was one that made your list because I'm not sure
Right.
nasturtiums necessarily a cutting flower. So for those who are kind of like trying to tell the difference between what a cut flower or a cut garden is and other flowers, how would you distinguish the two?
Sure, it's what you do with them. So, a cutting garden's purpose is that the flowers are going to grow up and they're going to be cut as soon as they're at the right proper stage, which that then initiates more flowers to grow. So, you have a constant regrowth versus a landscape or that type of situation. You plant flowers and you watch them bloom and then they start to fade. And then you figure out, well, what am I going to do? You either let it go or you pinch them. Or so the cutting garden concept just really keeps fresh new flowers constantly coming. It's super simple to do and it is really beneficial for all involved.
Wow, I hadn't thought about it like that, but that makes sense. I mean, the example of nasturtium, I know that it's beautiful. It's going to be beautiful for a couple months, and then it will eventually, like you said, fade. And I have to be like, okay, would I take it out now?
Right,
But you're saying with the cutting garden, now we're the next thing we're going to talk about is the difference between cool season and warm season flowers, because I found that to be very fascinating. But the cutting garden is meant to be more of you just continually cut it and
right.
continually have more and more coming, which I think everybody's going to love that concept. But let's move on to the cool season versus warm season flowers, because I did not realize really that there was a difference, which is, I think, the same that a lot of vegetable gardeners don't realize there's a difference between cool season and warm season vegetables either. And my question, like, can you just give a quick top level overview of what the difference is? Because you go in detail, like you separate them into the two different camps in your book. Can you give a high level overview of the difference
Sure.
between the two?
So first off, I primarily only grow annuals. We're not talking about perennials and shrubs and all those other things. And there are what's called, there's two in my world, there's two types of annuals: cool season hardy annuals, and then there's warm season tender annuals. Cool season hardy annuals are like snapdragons and pansies and stuff that many of us plant out in the fall that they go through winter and survive and then take off in spring. Then there's warm season, which is stuff like tomatoes and basil and zinnias and sunflowers. So their preferred conditions are either warm or cool. And when you plant them at the proper time, they thrive with little intervention from us.
So with cool season flowers, you talked about planting them in the fall, and I'm sure those can tell by both of our southern accents that we're not growing up in the north. So can you tell me how someone's is to decide whether they could plant a cool season annual in the fall or whether they should wait till the other early spring?
Sure, that is a great question. So flowers are we what we have established from my very first book 10 years ago was called Cool Flowers, was about this very subject we're talking about. Our grandmothers and great grandmas knew all about this, y'all. They knew about planting peas during the winter to have early spring harvest and to plant these cool season flowers. So what we've done is in my books we have included winter hardiness zones. Like if a plant is winter hardy to zone 5, like Rudbeckias, we grow a lot of cool season hardy annual Rudbeckias, not the perennial varieties. And you can fall plant them up to zone 5. They go through winter beautifully as little baby plants. So you need to know what the plant's winter hardiness zone or temperature is and what your winter hardiness zone is. If it survives your winter, you have great benefits to fall plant it.
So with those, are there some that are still cool season but that you wouldn't like, remind me where you're located, your zone. I think that'll be helpful for people listening,
Sure,
but that you wouldn't plant in the fall, but you'd plant in the early spring
sure,
because you
sure.
don't know if they would survive your winter?
So I'm in southeastern Virginia. We are zone 8. And so we can plant pretty much all the cool season hardy annuals almost in the fall. And then we can follow in very early spring another planting for succession planting. However, there are some that just don't do well during our winters. I think of straw flowers and stock. Those are ones that we don't even plant them in the fall. We only plant them, and it's not spring. We call it very early spring because that's like up to 8 weeks before your last spring frost.
Yeah, I was thinking you'd put cosmos in your cool season section.
Mm,
I'm
no,
right. Am I not right?
that's warm.
That's a warm
Yeah.
one. That makes sense because I'm like, wait a minute, I've had cosmos die
Yeah.
in early
Yeah, no,
spring.
it
But
won't they
okay.
won't survive winter. Wouldn't we love that though?
Yes, I must have been thinking of a different one. But yes, do you find though that, because I saw that you planted, or at least correct me if I'm wrong, it's been a couple weeks since I finished your book, but if you plant them the cool season, one in the fall and another succession in the early spring, do you find that the ones in the early spring are a little bit more tender to the cold weather than the ones that had grown through the winter, or are they going to be okay either
No,
way?
they're fine either way as far as cold tolerance. What the difference that you will see is that the fall planted ones will be more abundant. The stems will be twice as tall. There'll be more of them, and the plants are more disease and pest resistant because they're so well established. Then you plant in the very early spring; those will still usually do pretty okay, but just know it's only better if you could have planted them in the fall.
Okay. That makes sense. So we kind of touched on this, and this is what I was telling you before we recorded. People who have listened to my podcast, they know how I harp on succession planting
Mm,
because I mean, I kind of came up on it by accident, realizing in Arkansas that it was really the key to be able to plant so much longer in the year. And then I'm realizing that it's not just Arkansas that benefits from this, so many other climates and zones can benefit from it as well. But I never had considered succession planting being something that I could do with flowers until I started noticing those nasturtiums fading, my calendula fading, and seeing that the zinnias and the marigolds go crazy and the sunflowers in the summer. And I'm like, wait a minute, I bet I could succession plant
yep.
my flowers like I do my vegetables. And you spent a lot of time talking about that in your book. And I love that. I just kept wanting to say amen, even though I'm so new at this, right? But my question for you is for those who are interested and maybe brand new at flowers like I still am, what role does succession planting play in getting blooms for longer?
Sure. So out of the gate, those fall and very early spring planted cool season hardy annuals are the first blooms in spring. I wished I could bring the buckets over here. So here we are in, mid-April. I'm in southeastern Virginia. I have no greenhouses or hoop houses. I am a 100% field grower. I am looking at buckets of saponaria and bachelor buttons and snapdragons and Chinese forget me nots and sweet Williams and Cerinthe. Those are because they hit spring exactly when they were ready, set to go when spring hit instead of just getting their foundation going, right?
Yeah. And then do you have an idea of when, like you mentioned having blooms for longer. I know in reading your book, some of the crops are just like you have the bloom and then if I'm not mistaken, like some sunflowers, you're done with that plant. But a lot of the plants are continual
Yeah,
bloom. With those cool season ones, do you just kind of eye when they're not doing so well in the heat? Like when do you know when to swap those out
sure.
with the new warm season
So,
crops?
and that's the biggest challenge for many people is that they're afraid when to take stuff out. So here on our flower farm, we have big beds of flowers. When we harvest a bed, let's say cool season hardy annuals, and it's like, oh gosh, you're having to look for the next flower to cut, or the stems are getting shorter and shorter because of the heat, or there's a disease or a pest issue. That's when it's time to pull them out and pop your warm season in. And
Mm,
what you have to understand is that when you succession plant and stuff is petering out, you're just so much better off to pull that plant out and have your next plant to go right in because that helps to keep weeds at bay because you don't have plants that aren't really filling the space like they're supposed to. And so it's just knowing when to cut for us is when it stops producing up to our par. And we're pretty quick to mow a bed down and replace it with
mm.
something else.
I think that's a challenge that beginners have to deal with, and I know me also with vegetables as well. It's given a little bit, so I don't want to take it out yet,
Exactly.
but I know every single time I've made the decision you're talking about and just taking something out to be able to put something in, I'm always grateful that I did
Yes.
because it just becomes, and I can imagine flowers will be even maybe more
Yeah.
become kind of an eyesore once they start not doing so great.
Well, and I mean, but the problem for me is the if you leave a bed and it's not really producing, and then the weeds start creeping in is the big problem because it's not the canopy's not as thick, which is really holds the weed pressure down for us. I like you, am in the south, and we grow great weeds here if you give them half an inch. And so we find that it's gotten easier and easier for me to actually just take them out because we always have new plants standing in the background ready to be plugged in. And I'm looking for a home for them, so that helps.
Yeah, that was my next question. You've kind of alluded to this and you talk about this more extensively in your book, but as far as what I remember reading, you said you have new plants ready. So even crops that are easy to direct sow, you're not direct sowing, you're starting them ahead of time, right?
Yeah, the only time we direct sow as commercial growers is in the fall when the conditions are just so much more conducive to easy, quick seed sowing, like some of the cool season hardy annuals. The weed pressure is so strong here in the summer, spring and summer. Plus, I don't know about you, but I'm just not a very good seed tender out in the garden. I mean, when you sow seeds out in the garden, you should really be watering them just about every single day. And guess what else starts growing the second you start watering? The weed seeds. We
Mm.
find as commercial growers, it is so much less labor and so much more successful and a better stand of plants. And you don't have to waste seeds over sowing and then thin, which you have to do to get a full bed of crop that we start 95% of it. I think I sow probably like 6 or 7 different varieties of seeds in the fall, and that's it. And we have tried it from time to time. Somebody will challenge me on it, and I'll say, all right, this year we're going to direct sow some zinnias or sunflowers or whatever. And it is so much more work to keep the weeds at bay while they're sprouting and growing up. And so yeah, but that's kind of the, commercial growers, quickest, least expensive, best way to do everything. And who doesn't want to do that even as a gardener?
Yeah, and like you said, I want to pull this out because people may have missed it. Is when you're direct sowing, part of it is having to oversow and then go back and
Yep.
thin, and that. I mean, I don't know about you, but some of these flower seed packets, they're so specialty that you get not very many seeds, and so that helps your seeds go longer.
Well, you're so right because I am a seed seller. I mean, there are seeds there's coxcomb, for instance. We have one coxcomb that costs 20 times more than all the others. It's the seed. That's
Mhm.
why that seed packet, when you open it, has 10 or 15 seeds in it. You would never want to sow those outside in the garden. And so we need people to continue hybridizing and creating these beautiful, wonderful, delicious vegetables and flower seeds. But yeah, this is one way to really make the most of it.
Now, are you growing these under lights?
For seed starting, oh yeah. I mean,
Mhm.
standard operating procedure, seedling heat mat till they sprout, 50% sprout, then they grow over to a grow light. I do everything indoors in a 10 by 10 grow room with racks, and I can support, I think it's like up to 9,000 because I'm a soil blocker, seed starter, and I can support 9,000 plants in that little 10 by 10 room until they go outside to be hardened off. So yes, and we know now the life of a seedling in those first few weeks really dictates the performance of those plants, vegetables, any plant, their disease
Mhm.
resistance and how well they perform. The others will go. But you know how you always have those superstar plants? If you go back and look, those are the ones that you got them to sprout quick, you moved them to light quick, you got them out to harden them off quick, and you got them in the garden into their preferred conditions. And that just sets up for a superstar show.
I love that you pointed that out. So I'm going to kind of go into, like, you can coach me for a second here, but I think it'll be beneficial for those who don't have lights yet.
Okay.
Is I started Now we're recording this in April, although the people are not going to be hearing this until May. I started just last weekend on Saturday sunflowers, zinnias, and marigolds in my cell trays. I have a greenhouse, and I'm just keeping them in my greenhouse because we're already in the 70s, 80s, no problem. And I'm not putting them under grow lights, but it's warm outside. I'm keeping them watered. Am I going to run into any problems with not putting them under grow lights, or do you think that's fine because they're warm season
Well, it
crops?
all depends. It's very variety specific, but it's not really about the heat as it is the length of the daylight. And so
Mm.
we run our grow lights 16 to 18 hours a day. And what that does is grows plants quickly, grows vegetation quickly, and as well as those seeds that are sensitive to day length it delays their bloom because they're not getting under in a greenhouse versus a grow light. The shorter day lengths will delay the blooming actually in some of them. So many growers, I mean, big growers obviously don't use grow lights. They adjust their schedules accordingly, start later because the days are longer. So it's a little bit deeper than we even want to, more than, I mean, I'm not a deep diver on any one area of farming and gardening. I just know what I have to know to get the end result, right? The very best one. And so greenhouse obviously works, but there are benefits to grow lights for those of us that don't have greenhouses, sorry.
Okay. Yeah, that'll be interesting. And do you like, sometimes I'll cheat and I'll start seeds indoors, vegetables or whatever, and then I'll plant them out really quickly after they sprout.
Right.
I'm just mainly trying to get them a controlled sprout environment. But is there a certain size that when you're transplanting out these plants that is most beneficial for transplant?
Sure. So, two things. One, again, because we soil block, we do what you were just saying. We sprout a lot of stuff, carrots and radishes, because they're just kind of difficult and you don't want to over sow. We sprout them in small blocks. And then once they pop, which is days, that's what we plant
Mhm.
out in the garden. So that's a great idea. We do that too with soil blocks. But the size transplant we're looking for to go out to the garden is 3 to 5 inches. I say size versus weeks because my environment may be much different than your environment, and I may grow them faster, which I typically do. My grow room gets really warm. It's south facing. It's got heat mat going in the corner. It's got a bunch of grow lights going in there. So our seedlings just grow like gangbusters. But if you're trying to grow in a cool garage or basement, you're going to take a lot longer. So the ultimate goal is 3 to 5 inches.
That's really helpful, thank you. I may I don't know that I'll put some grow lights on them right now, they just sprouted. They sprouted in 2 days. I
Mhm.
was shocked. I was like, "This is really fast," but that'll be interesting maybe in the future, kinda compare grow light plus greenhouse. But I want to shift over to harvesting because this was the part that got me actually kind of excited about the cut flowers that I am growing, and then the more that I've added this year is the section in your book about harvesting, and you already told us that continual harvesting is the key. I imagine that's probably the hardest thing to get beginners to understand how important it is. And so I may want you to reiterate that. But also, what are the most important things that you would tell a new flower gardener about harvesting? Because I could tell you were very passionate about that in your book.
Sure. So if what is the purpose of your flower garden? Is it for you to gaze at while you're doing dishes from your window? Or is it for a cutting garden for you to bring those flowers inside? So, my number one piece of advice is to put the cutting garden out of sight from your patio and from your kitchen sink so you won't be inclined to enjoy it from a distance. I mean, not that it's ugly by any means, but I find that if those flowers are growing on the side of your house where you can't see them, it is really easy to go out there and do your harvesting chores. To bring them inside. Consider that cutting garden as a contribution to your indoor scape, not your outdoor scape. And so, I can remember before I was a flower farmer reading in magazines, it's like, oh, you should put it behind the garage. And I always assumed they meant because it was ugly. And it's not, ours are gorgeous. But it's the
Yeah.
fact that when they're out of sight, you're more inclined to cut it as routinely and regularly as you should, because otherwise you wouldn't see it.
I had never thought about that, and now I'm, like, rethinking it all because 'cause I've got everything planned, like, right outside my door. So what you're saying and I can see the temptation, let me just make sure I'm hearing you right. What you're saying is that those beautiful Apricota cosmos, I have not cut yet because I just love watching them, and then that's not gonna be good for
That's not
the
a cutting
growth of the
garden.
plant.
First off, cosmos should be cut when they're cracking. You shouldn't even see the blooms in your garden. And so you need to plant those right where you have them planted as your landscape, as your ornamental enjoy garden. But if you want to have that stuff, and so then somebody will say, well, I just want to cut a few. Well, the problem with not keeping, and the smaller the better, 3 by 10 foot is the perfect size cutting garden for most people. That's the size of a picnic table. And by cutting it clean means every time you go out there, at least once a week, but recommended twice a week, that you're going to always have new up and coming shoots. Let's just say you decided to, you're having your family over Sunday after church for lunch, and you think, oh my goodness, Sunday morning, I'm going to go out and cut some blooms to put on my kitchen table for lunch. And you go out there, and it's like when you're from a distance, they look pretty okay. But when you get up close, it's like, oh, these are all old blooms. Gosh, I don't even really see any new ones coming along. That is not what happens in a cutting garden. That's what happens in a landscape. And that's why I like to draw the line in the sand. And it doesn't have to be big 3 by 5 foot. If you have tiny space and you just want a little handful of flowers every single week and enjoy it, small is better. We believe that for flower farmers too, but you just can't believe how much a small space will produce when you cut it constantly.
So what happens because I'm sure we all have been here, and obviously I am right now if I can see my blooms. What happens to the plant when we don't cut it in time?
You mean the bloom
If
itself?
you
And
or the plant itself,
sure,
like, if I've if I'm trying to decide, do I want the landscape or do I want the cutting
sure.
garden? But let's say I want the cutting garden and I let my blooms go too long, what happens?
Yeah, so the plant just kind of starts to poop out because the whole purpose of an annual plant's mission in life is to grow a flower, to grow a seed. When it grows the seed, the message that plant is getting is, guess what? Your job is done here. Do not send up any more stems or be really slow and puny about it. When you
Mhm.
constantly are pruning those stems off or harvesting them, that keeps that plant in that constant motion of sending up more and more shoots. And I mean, it literally invigorates the plant. It's kind of like they say, if you're in motion, you're not going to lose your mobility. But if the once you sit down, you just start to lose stuff when you don't use it. And it's the very same thing on plants.
That makes a lot of sense, and this may sound like a silly question, but I remember my mom talking about this often as, like, she wasn't a cut flower gardener, but she was more of a landscape gardener, but she talked about deadheading. And can you distinguish the 2
Sure,
and maybe define
sure.
deadheading for those who didn't grow up with a mom
Yeah.
talking about that all the time?
So you don't deadhead a cutting garden. Deadheading is what you do in a landscape. And you do that as a flower begins to fade and starts to look yucky, and you pinch it off to do the very same thing that you do to a cutting garden when you cut the stem and harvest it. We just cut those stems much earlier in its individual stems process so that we can benefit from a beautiful, fresh flower. When you cut a cutting garden flower at the proper time, they last longer. They are near perfect, no bug blemishes. The wind hasn't whipped it and dried it out, and they just last longer indoors. So it's the same end result of deadheading and cutting a cutting garden, but you just do it at two different times with two. Deadheading, it's dead, it's gone. Cutting
Mhm.
garden, you get to enjoy a whole show indoors.
That's very helpful. And before we get to the final question, I want to point listeners out to parts of your book that I found were very helpful. Number one, you have plant profiles where you specifically teach when to cut each flower. Like you said, like if you need to cut before the blossom even opens or whatever, you have that because it's different for each plant, but also where to cut it. And then speaking of harvesting, what really got me excited is you were talking about things to do when you're cutting and specifically what to do right after you cut the flower to enable them to last longer, like what kind of solution to put them in and that kind of thing. That was fascinating because sometimes I think for me it's like, what's the point in a cutting garden if it'll only last for 2 days, but I know longevity is based on the plant, but the little hacks that you provide in the book, I think, are so helpful for others. So I wanted to make sure to bring that up to show that you have so many of the how tos in there, and they're very in depth. But my last question for you is for someone who may be like me and they're new. So one thing that I saw in your book is it's so complete. It has so many different options of flowers. Some I've heard of, a lot I haven't, or maybe I've seen them, but I've never known what their names
Mm.
were. And it can be overwhelming, the different options, because there's so many beautiful flowers. So, how does someone new at growing flowers decide what kinds they should start with? And maybe do you have a few easy ones, a handful of ones that you would recommend that someone to use to get started?
First off, starting small is the key. And we really lead people to a 3 by 10 size garden. We actually make seed collections with plans for that because that's where every new gardener should start. And then it's just those good old garden flowers, we zinnias and coxcomb and, lemon basil. One variety, Miss Burns, is the one that we grow because she does last long in a vase. I mean, that makes your bouquet smell as beautiful as ever. You could grow those three and if you grow the mixed zinnias, which is different colors, grow mixes instead of just one color, it just changes from week to week. And they're super easy as long as you're putting them in full sun and preparing your soil, whether you direct sow them, which is possible, but you just have to be more attentive. And it just keep it simple. Just grow 3 or 4 or 5 different ones and grow like 5 to 8 plants of each one, plant them together. And the other part of a cutting garden is that we plant much closer together than landscape plants because you are constantly cutting them. It allows you to get a lot more from a small space.
I love that. So you mentioned the zinnias and you said lemon basil. I think those are all warm season, which
Yes,
is great because we're headed into the summer. So those are probably the plants that people will be
right.
growing. But you sell collections even of the ones that people will need to be starting in the
Oh,
fall?
sure. Yeah, there's cool season hardy annual collections, several different warm ones, and I mean, there's lots of resources there to help guide you onto which seeds. And the seeds are broken out in cool season and warm season. So if it's summer, don't even go look at the cool season stuff, right? That helps to keep you
Yeah.
from getting it confused because I do realize how confused I was when I started farming 27 years ago. I was barely a gardener at that time, and yeah, we just try to make it super simple because it is so easy and so successful if you just follow a few guidelines and stick with some strong growers, and it's just so rewarding.
Well, I'm excited. Just reading your book inspired me in so many ways. And as you mentioned, 3 by 10, I have cut back my vegetable garden this year. I'm trying to cut back this year for different reasons, but I've been thinking about introducing more flowers for that purpose. And your book definitely inspired me with that. Now, the book is called, for those on YouTube, I'll show it again. It's called The Cut Flower Handbook. But as you mentioned before, this is not your only book. So can you talk to us about like other resources where people can learn more about you and what all else you have for
Sure.
gardeners?
So I actually happen to have my books here. I'll show them. This is my very first book. This was called Cool Flowers, which is all about the cool season hardy annuals and just figuring out that whole concept. Then a few years after that one, Vegetables Love Flowers came along. And this is really a great, this is not about growing vegetables, y'all. This is about growing a 3 season cutting garden in a vegetable patch and all the benefits and how to do it without using pesticides because we don't use even organic pesticides here typically. And so it just really teaches people how I farm and garden. And so our big website, which includes, lots of free resources, educational platforms, is thegardenersworkshop.com. And I am very active on social media. I have a YouTube channel, and you can go to thegardenersworkshop.com. That's basically home base and connect with me there. And there you'll fall in. There are so many. We have blogs and podcasts and just a lot of stuff. We've been doing this for a long time, and that just tends to build up all the resources. And so we got you covered, whatever it is that you need.
And I know we didn't go into your background. I've heard it on other podcasts before, but I love that if I'm remembering it correctly, you came to all of this as an adult, right?
Yes,
Like
I did.
all of like and so I think that's inspiring to a lot of adults now who may have a vague memory of grandparents growing, but are kind of like me that I didn't pay much attention. So I kind of had to start from scratch. And I feel like the way that you've written in your book, and I'm sure the other ones also are very understandable for beginners
Yes.
because you remember being one.
Well, I tend to keep things really simple and clear. And I am a pretty severe dyslexic. And one of our gifts is actually clearing the fog and just getting down to the business part of things. And I would say that's perhaps my strongest niche is that I try not to blow much air. Just
Yes.
get down and do it. And that just empowers people, just like I just happen to be guided by somebody like that. And it just really, really is empowering, and it's great. It's a great opportunity to garden. Everybody can do it a little bit.
Yes, I love it. I found that to be the case with your book as well, and I know there are some that I keep going back to, and I know this one will definitely be one, especially when it comes down to harvesting. And I need to go refresh that cosmos since they just started blooming this week, so that I can hopefully get more blooms. So, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. This has been a delight for me. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate the work that you do to help gardeners.
Hey, thank you so much. And it's been an honor to be here and look forward to the future of more vegetable gardeners putting flowers in their veggie patch.